Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Food for the Faithful channel with me, Bill Reimer, your reluctant prophet. I have a deep and lengthy episode for you today, referring to how C.S. Lewis explained in The Abolition of Man the effects that postmodernism would have on society. So let me begin by reading. We need to understand the psychology of people who seek to control everything, while themselves are totally unrestrained in their own behavior. C.S. Lewis explains this in his book, The Abolition of Man. It was C.S. Lewis's primary thesis in that book that modern education and culture are quietly dismantling the very idea of objective moral truth, what he calls the Tao, a universal natural law of right and wrong that cuts across all civilizations. He argues that when we treat values as mere subjective feelings or preferences, rather than real truths, we end up producing men without chests, or as Dr. Gad Saad, the famous evolutionary psychologist, says, invertebrate castrati, men with no testicle fortitude and backbone. People who have intellect and appetite, but no moral backbone. The final twist, the very elites who push this relativism will eventually use science and technology to remake humanity itself, abolishing real human nature in the process. At least this is their attempt. In short, reject the Tao and you don't lose morality. You lose the capacity to be human. So let me map this directly onto Canadian public sector governance frameworks. Here is a concise but rigorous explanation framed explicitly through C.S. Lewis's concept of the Tao and its relevance to postmodern governance and critical theory, showing the structural consequences. 1. What Lewis means by the Tao, the starting point. By the Tao, Lewis does not mean Taoism as a religion, but what he calls objective value. The shared moral grammar found across civilizations, natural law, traditional morality, or the belief that some things are really good, just, noble, or evil, regardless of preferences or power. Lewis argues that reason itself depends on this moral backdrop. We cannot reason what ought to be unless we already accept some values as given rather than constructed. I provide all the links for my research below each section. When Lewis says rejecting the Tao leads to the abolition of man, he is not claiming people become immoral monsters overnight. He is saying something subtler and more devastating, namely the loss of the conditions that make moral reasoning, human dignity, and even disagreement intelligible at all. 2. What rejecting the Tao looks like in postmodern and critical frameworks. Postmodernism and many strands of critical theory are explicitly anti-foundational. They reject objective or universal moral standards. Stable meanings, truth as something discovered rather than constructed. Appeals to nature, human essence, or natural law. Instead, values are treated as products of power relations, a la Foucault. Social constructions contingent on discourse. Historically situated narratives with no privileged standpoint. In governance, this translates into administrative and policy frameworks that emphasize narrative over norm, lived experience over shared standards, equality outcomes over principled constraints, and power analysis over moral evaluation. This is not accidental. It flows directly from postmodern epistemology. 3. Why Lewis would say this erodes the capacity to be human. Lewis's core claim is that values are not optional add-ons to reason. They are its precondition. Once value judgments are treated as merely subjective or political, several things follow. A. Moral language collapses into technique. If good means what advances an approved framework, then ethics become instrumental, a matter of policy optimization, not moral truth. Governance becomes management of outcomes, not judgment of right and wrong. Lewis foresaw this as the rise of conditioners, elites who shape behavior without reference to objective standards. B. Power replaces persuasion. In a post-Tao system, disagreement is no longer about truth, but about positionality. Those who dissent are not wrong, but problematic. This aligns closely with postmodern governance models that treat resistance as something to be managed rather than reasoned with. C. The chest disappears. Lewis's famous image of men without chests refers to people who can calculate with their head and desire with their belly, but lack trained moral sentiment, the ability to recognize what is worthy of admiration or of contempt. Postmodern systems often explicitly distrust such judgment as biased or oppressive, hollowing out the very faculty that makes moral agency possible. 4. How this plays out when injected into all facets of governance. When critical postmodern assumptions become totalizing, embedded in law, in education, H&R, public administration, and policy design, the result is not neutrality, but rather a new orthodoxy. Rules without roots, norms enforced without appeal to shared common goods, to shared human goods, rather. Rights without duties. Claims are severed from obligations that are grounded in human nature. Equity without limits. No principled stopping point, because no objective telos exists. Inclusion without truth. Belonging prioritized over whether beliefs correspond to reality. Lewis's warning is that this does not free humanity from constraint. It subjects humanity to whatever controls or whoever controls the framework. The conquest of nature becomes the conquest of man by man, justified not by truth, but by theory. 5. The core insight, restated plainly. To reject the Tao is not merely to lose traditional morality, it is to deny that humans share a nature that makes moral reasoning possible. In postmodern governance, this denial manifests as systems that still command, judge, and punish, but no longer in the name of truth, only in the name of power, process, or progress. Lewis's claim is stark but concise. Once you deny objective value, you do not get a better kind of human. You get a manipulable one. So how does postmodern governance unintentionally recreate moral absolutism under a different name? Below is a conceptually rigorous explanation of this phenomenon. So as I'm reading here, this of course is all written in the blog. If you wish to read along as you're listening to me speak, you may do that by clicking on the video and reading the blog at the same time. The video is always plugged into my blog. Postmodern governance unintentionally recreates moral absolutism, but under a different name. since it is grounded in mainstream scholarship on postmodernism, i.e., Foucault, Lyotard, and Habermas, and then explicitly connected this to governance. Here are 4 steps related to this connection. 1. Postmodernism's stated aim: the rejection of moral absolutes. Classical postmodern theory explicitly rejects objective truth, universal moral values, and foundational moral authority. As summarized by Encyclopedia Britannica, postmodernism treats reality, knowledge, and value as constructed by discourse, denying the existence of objective or absolute moral values. Lyotard famously defines postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives, that is, toward any universal moral or historical story claiming authority over others. In theory, this leads to moral pluralism and humility, but in reality, it does the opposite. 2. The internal contradiction. Critique requires normativity. Here's the pivot point. Postmodern and critical theories continuously condemn oppression, exclusion, injustice, harm, and domination. But condemnation is not morally neutral. To say something ought not exist presupposes a standard by which it is wrong. This is why critics call the self-refutation or the crypto-normativity problem. Postmodernism denies universal moral standards, yet it relies on strong moral judgments to function at all. 3. How power quietly replaces truth, which is Foucault's contribution. In his power knowledge framework, truth is not discovered, rather it's produced. Norms emerge from discursive and institutional power. Knowledge is inseparable from governance and control. Importantly, Foucault does not deny norms, he relocates them. They are no longer true, rather they are enforced and therefore very illiberal. Habermas explicitly criticizes Foucault for that move, arguing that Foucault smuggles in moral judgment he cannot justify, what Habermas calls crypto-normativity. 4. What happens when this enters governance? When postmodern assumptions are operationalized in governance, 4 things happen simultaneously at the same time. A. Absolute return, but disguised as process. Governance frameworks assert non-negotiable commitments. Example, equity, inclusion, harm reduction. But explicitly deny grounding them in universal human goods. They become mandatory, enforced, and non-contestable. This is moral absolutism without metaphysics. B. Disagreements become pathology. Because norms are framed as outcomes of justice rather than moral claims, dissent is interpreted as ignorance, bias, harm, and resistance to progress. How many times have I had those labels thrown at me, which I wear as badges of honor? This follows directly from the power, knowledge, logic. C. Moral language therefore loses appeal to reason. Debate no longer asks, is it true or good? Rather, it asks, who is harmed or what group is being marginalized? These are important questions, but they're not sufficient as universal moral criteria, and they are not open to rational falsification. D. Enforcement replaces persuasion. Without shared moral truth, governance relies on compliance mechanisms, training and re-education, performance metrics, and cultural enforcement. And the performance metrics are always based on how much did you comply with the sanctioned postmodern narrative. Exactly the outcomes of postmodernism, the outcomes critics of postmodernism warn about. 5. Why is this absolutism, not relativism? Moral absolutism is defined by 3 features. Number 1, claims that can't be overridden. 2, norms that apply regardless of individual judgment. And 3, sanctions for dissent. This is exactly what we're living under. Postmodern governance meets all 3. It simply relocates authority from truth to power. As critic notes, postmodernism often becomes the very grand narrative it sought to dismantle, a universal story about power, oppression, and legitimacy that admits no external challenge. It refuses to be challenged. 6. Lewis's insight confirmed philosophically. C.S. Lewis predicted this exact pattern. When objective value is denied, values don't disappear, they become imposed. Postmodern governance does not abolish morality, it centralizes it, bureaucratizes it, and immunizes it from critique. Habermas, no conservative, arrived at the same conclusion but from a different angle. Without shared rational norms, critique collapses into power struggles dressed as ethics. And 7. The distilled conclusion. Postmodern grievance rejects moral absolutes in theory, but creates them in practice. Grounded not in truth or human nature, but in institutional power and moralized outcomes. This is why it feels simultaneously relativistic in philosophy and absolutist in enforcement, which is why everything in Canada feels fake, like false and informed conformity that denies the very foundational principles of Western philosophical underpinnings. Postmodernism is anti-Christian to its ideological core and must be denounced and exposed for the manipulative falsehood that it is. It is indeed the manifestation of what C.S. Lewis explained in The Abolition of Man. These are things to think and pray about on this March the 3rd, because we are being faced with a government that has foregone the use of reason and has abandoned the very principles upon which Western society has been founded. God bless you all. Have a wonderful afternoon.